Today we're going to talk about biodiversity and why it is so important and what are some of the effects that human beings are exerting on the biodiversity of planet Earth. And in this initial movie, we're going to talk about evolution and how it contributes to biodiversity, how variation in individuals contributes to evolution, and therefore how biodiversity is critical for evolution. Let's talk a little bit about evolution, and I think that'll help demonstrate why biodiversity is so important. And next we'll talk a little bit about aspects of biodiversity that ecologists study, and how we're affecting aspects of biodiversity and how we can help that. Okay, so this is in the upper left corner here. This is Charles Darwin. As a younger man, most of you are probably used to seeing him slightly older with the long beard, but here he is in his young state. So the map is demonstrating a trip that he took on his friend's boat. He was upper class and had some money and didn't really know what to do with his life, and he heard his friend was going on a trip with a boat and he tagged along. So the red lines demonstrate where they went. And this gave him a really unique opportunity to see a lot of different species of animals and plants on Earth, and he logged a lot of that. And he ended up doing a lot of thought-based research and coming to a lot of conclusions of how he thought a lot of species, this high number of species, came to be present on Earth. And these ideas were the basis of his book about natural selection. And really, because of this, he's considered to be the grandfather of evolution, and started the study of evolution. In the blow-up here, they're showing you the Galapagos Islands, which is one of the last places that he stopped on his cruise. And what he saw here, so the Galapagos Islands are a lot of different small islands, and one thing he was really interested in were finches. And he saw here that on different islands there were different finches that were similar to each other in some ways, but also very different from each other in how they were adapted to the plants that were on that island. So the finches eat plants, and depending on what kind of plants were present on the island, they had different types of beaks. So for example, an insect eater finch would have a very sharp, pointy beak, and a seed eater might have a very big, strong strong beak that would allow it to crush seeds. And these observations really started Darwin thinking about how these adaptations had come about, and just observing that individuals were adapted to their environment led him to understand propose how evolution worked, and propose his theories about it. So when we talk about species, we're really talking about a group of individuals that can only breed with each other. So species is in a Latin word that means kind or appearance, and biologists will use a lot of different ways to compare and group individuals and organisms. We can use very sophisticated techniques now, like looking at your DNA and the DNA of all the individuals in a population, for example. But really, when we talk about species, we talk about individuals that can breed amongst themselves successfully. And speciation is the origin of new species. So throughout evolution, new species have arisen through modification of species that already existed. So this just states what I just said, that a species is a group of populations who the members have the potential to interbreed. And genes, so the genetic material that makes us who we are, can flow between populations. And so within a population, so within the human population, we share genes with each other that make us humans. And because we can't breed with other species on Earth, that really keeps the genes that make us unique within our species. So here's the diversity within the human species. This you might be more familiar with. And when we talk about diversity, this can be on several several levels. So there could be diversity within an ecosystem, or conversely, right? There's diversity of many different species in an ecosystem. So an ecosystem can have a large diversity of populations or a small diversity of populations. And then within a species itself, individuals can be very diverse, right? So when we looked at the previous slide of the different humans, that's a diversity within a species, but we're all the same species, and really 99 point whatever high percent of our DNA is similar to each other, even though to us, maybe on the outside, we look a little bit different. So let's get back to Darwin's finches. So he was interested in the adaptations that these finches had to the seeds and the worms and the other things that they were eating. So here's some of the drawings that from Darwin's publication. So here he's looking at different finches, and he's postulating, right, how they became adapted to their environment. So here's his study. This is you can go visit this in England if you're interested. So he sits down and he writes about the origin of species, and he developed two main ideas that we, as biologists and scientists, still continue to confirm and agree with today. So his two main ideas, let's look at the second one first, is that natural selection is the cause of adaptive evolution. And all natural selection means is that the strongest, the fittest survive. The strongest and the fittest survive. And that's hopefully a concept that you are somewhat familiar with, or sounds somewhat logical to you. And because of this descent with modification, because species are evolving over time continuously and changing over time, this is really the reason why life is so diverse. So the fact that we are not all clones of each other, and the fact that human beings are all a little bit different from each other, is what allows evolution to happen in the first place. Okay, so this is a brief summary of his book. The takeaway message that I want you to understand is just what natural selection is, and the fact that variation is required for natural selection to occur. So in his book, he mentions that members of a population vary greatly in their traits, right? So if we looked at the pictures of the human beings externally, right, just from those images of the faces, there's a lot of variability between humans or between other individuals in a different species. The second observation, which is also critical for natural selection to occur, is that we inherit traits from our parents. So we pass genes on to members of the next generation, and because these changes are heritable, because these variations are heritable, they're going to be selected for, right, if under certain pressures. Another observation is that there's usually limiting resources in an environment. So individuals produce more offspring than the environment can support, and this creates conflict or pressure or competition between individuals to either escape predation or to find food or any other resources. So because of that lack of resources, there's pressure. Some of them don't survive, but the individuals that have the best traits that give them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing, that's the critical part. And if these traits are inherited from generation to generation, over time they're going to change the nature of that species, and they're going to become more adapted to the local environment. So that's basically natural selection in a nutshell. So for example, when we looked at the finches, we can see, and we can follow this in the fossil record and in other ways, right? Just by sequencing DNA, we can see the similarities between different kinds of finches and create these trees that show the common ancestors that these finches had, and how over time speciation occurred. So different groups moved away from each other and became separate species, and now we have all of these diverse different species of finches that have different adaptations to their local environment. And we can see other examples of that. Elephants, for example, we have the elephants that we are familiar with today, and then we have other relatives of those animals, and we can still build these trees and look at the ancestors and how over time natural selection created these different these different populations and why they are adapted to their environment. And one thing that Darwin paid attention to, and you might have paid attention to as well, is that humans actually can induce artificial selection. So we do that with agriculture, right? We do that with plants. So if you look at what corn used to look like before humans came in and domesticated it, corn did not look like the corn that we see today. It looked like a little twig with a few kernels on it. You can look up the picture if you like. And over time, we selected for the corn that had the most number of kernels and was the most delicious. So we've artificially selected a lot of plants to eat, right? So one example is wild mustard, which gave rise to all of these different plants that some of us enjoy eating, right? Kale. And another example of artificial selection is dogs. So all dogs were bred by humans from wolves, which were the common ancestor, and we've bred them to be some of them are almost different species, I would say, although I think most dogs are considered the same species. And we've bred them to be very, very different, right? Have different personality traits and different physical traits. So that all happened through artificial selection, right? So we exerted selection on the population. Now, the variation is what we're interested in for our purposes of understanding biodiversity. Without variation between individuals, evolution can't happen. And that's a really, really, really critical point that I want you to understand. That's basically the point of this whole lecture. So if you have a clonal population of individuals, there's not going to be any traits to select against. Either all of those clones will be well adapted to their environment, or they won't. And there won't be over time some change in the progression of that species. So evolution will not happen if all of the individuals have the same traits. So diversity within a species is critical for evolution to happen, or for natural selection to happen. So that's really why diversity is so important within a species, and as well, just diversity of having many different species allows for that richness of biodiversity to continue to allow natural selection to take place and for new species to arise, and for the rich diversity that we require on Earth for it to continue operating the way it is. All right, so that was observation number 1 of Darwin's, that there's a lot of variability and that genes are inherited from parents to the next generation, and that most living things produce more offspring than the offspring that the environment can support, and more offspring than the ones that survive. So this is the summary of Darwin's observations and inferences. You can read this later. Like I said, the most important point is that I want you to understand natural selection and what is going on there, and to understand why the variation in individuals, why the diversity is so important for natural selection to occur. So again, what is natural selection? If some traits are advantageous, they will accumulate in the population. So more and more individuals are going to have those advantageous traits. So this explains why there's a match between organism and environment, why finches that had big, strong beaks were able to thrive on islands which had a lot of harder seeds that required those strong beaks. And here's a nice cartoon of natural selection. So let's say there's a diverse population of mice, and this condor can see the lighter colored mice more easily. They're going to pick off those individuals and eat them, and over time there's going to be a higher proportion of the population is going to be darker mice, and because they're going to be better adapted to avoiding that predator. Here's a very similar example. They're looking at little arthropods, and for some reason the fish that eat these arthropods prefer eating the bigger ones. Maybe they can see them better, or they're easier to catch, or probably they just notice them more. So they're going to continue to eat the big ones. So over time, the smaller little crustaceans are going to be the ones that are left, and they're going to reproduce. So over time, the population is going to get smaller and smaller. So that's natural selection in a nutshell. Here's a summary that you can read at your own leisure. I'll post these slides up on Canvas. But yeah, I just really want you to understand natural selection. It's going to be important for you, I would say, in general for your education, but also just in general for your appreciation of life and what it means to be living on Earth. Here's two nice examples of adaptation to the local environment when we are looking at insects that have camouflage capabilities or have become adapted to look like their environment, so that protects them from predation. So on top, you can see a flower mantid, and hopefully you can see where the legs of this insect are, and the antenna on top. So it looks just like the flower that it's sitting on, and on the bottom you have a stick mantid. So similar background. Both of them are from the same family, but both of them have become adapted to look like their local surroundings. Okay, so what brings about this diversity in the first place? So all of us have genetic material that we are made of. Every cell in our body has the same genes, right? We just have one set of instructions that make us who we are. And when we pass on these genes to our offspring, so when you make sperm and eggs, you actually introduce some mistakes or if you want to call them mistakes, mutations in the genetic code that you are giving to your offspring by just randomly changing some parts around. And this is a very interesting subject matter that you can learn more about in other biology classes. But the main point is that we actually don't inherit exactly the genetic material we have to our offspring. It is a little bit different. So our DNA mutates, and that just happens over time. So that's one way that new traits can arise slowly, right, bit by bit. Usually these are not beneficial changes, but sometimes they are. And because all of our DNA, right, my DNA and your DNA is a little bit different, because our DNA is different, when we think about the DNA of an entire species, we can think about the gene pool of all of the genes that exist in that species, all of the possible genetic variations and genes that can be passed on to the offspring of individuals in that species. Okay, so for example, here are mice in the island of Madeira, which is an island off of Portugal. And you can see that they had the same ancestor, but when we actually look at the chromosomes, so these are all the chromosomes that are present in the mouse nucleus, so this is all of the genetic material, we can see that their chromosomes are actually quite different. So over time they've evolved to have different gene pools. So these two species, it looks like they have different numbers of chromosomes. They're probably not going to be able to breed with each other. Usually two individuals with a different number of chromosomes can't successfully reproduce. Alright, so what are some other changes that happen that allow natural selection to occur? Other factors that are going to change the gene pool in a species are going to be genetic drift and other forms of gene flow, which we'll talk about now, how they change the genetic makeup of a species. So if we looked at the gene pool of that population of mice on that island, and we compare the gene pools of the mice on two different sides of that island, we saw that their genetic material was different. One thing that might have happened there is genetic drift. So at some point, some of those mice, maybe all of the mice lived on one side of the island, and at some point some of them managed to get to the other side, and a few things happened there. right? There could have been a founder effect where these mice moved and started a new population there. And what happened was there was genetic drift. So because these new mice from the old population started a new population, some of the features that were present in this new group of mice could have been just brought about because there was a movement of individuals that didn't represent the entire population. So, for example, if we look at a population of flowers that has 3 colors, so red, pink, and white, and by some chance these 2 flowers that have a white box around them are able to reproduce, the next generation is going to be all red flowers. So that's just a genetic drift in the genes that are responsible for flower color. A lot of similar things can happen, and they have slightly different names, but really it's all the same principle. So for example, the founder effect is when a small part of a population moves to another area and starts reproduces and starts another group of the same species. And because the founder group is kind of small, a lot of the times the genetic diversity is going to be lower than the original population, and over time that new population is going to probably change so much that it's going to become a different species than the original population. So this is because a small number of individuals started the new population, and this is very relevant to our understanding of biodiversity in our context of looking at it from an ecological perspective, because when we are having an effect on the biodiversity of the animals on Earth, and if we limit the population of certain types of animals to be very small, we end up with these founder effects, and it can have a deleterious effect on the new population. So if the few founders happen to have a few traits that aren't advantageous to life, so the entire new population is going to be negatively affected, negatively impacted because they had to undergo that founder effect. A bottleneck effect is very similar to a founder effect. A founder effect is really the movement of individuals. A bottleneck effect might be because of some other catastrophe, for example, so a flood or a hurricane or something. So if some catastrophe like that caused a sudden change in the population size might have been reduced very suddenly, and then the remaining individuals reproduced. So the resulting gene pool may no longer be reflective of the original population's gene pool. So again, if we're starting a new population with a very small number of individuals, it's going to it potentially could be very dissimilar to the population that they started out with. So here's a nice cartoon of bottleneck effect. So they're showing you in a bottle to demonstrate why it was named that. So here's the individuals in a bottle, and if you just take a few of those individuals out, maybe we exclude these yellow individuals, so we have a very non-diverse new population that's going to come about. So for example, let's think about an observation, an experiment that ecologists did, since we are budding ecologists. So they looked at the prairie chickens of Illinois, and human beings had a very deleterious effect on that population. So over time, the number of prairie chickens got very, very small, and then the surviving birds had very low levels of genetic variation and very low viability in the eggs that they were hatching. So scientists looked at the genetic diversity of the chickens in Illinois, and what they saw was that they looked at the number of alleles, so they saw that the numbers were quite low compared to numbers of alleles that the birds had as recently as 30 to 60 years ago. So they saw that the number of different kinds of alleles, so that just means different kind of genes, so when we think about alleles in, let's say, for human eye color, so there might be an allele that codes for brown or an allele that doesn't code for brown eyes. So we just think about it as, hair color, for example, right? So it could be red, brown, blonde, etc. So the number of alleles that could be at a certain area in the DNA, a certain gene, were a lot lower. So the genetic diversity was a lot lower. And for some reason, this led to a lot fewer eggs being viable. So what they did was they went to another area where there were chickens also living, and they brought some of those outside birds into the Illinois area, and these new birds, or these foreign birds, reproduced with the local birds, and now the allele diversity went back up, and the population was more viable and more of the eggs hatched. So that was a great success story, but it also demonstrates why these bottleneck and founder effects can be really bad for the species. And what can happen is that even if the population doesn't completely die out, you can see that this population had a lot of trouble reproducing. So even though they didn't completely go extinct, they probably would have been on that track because of the problems that they had reproducing due to their, whatever genetic problems that they had because of that bottleneck effect or founder effect. Okay, so that explains what happened. This is a summary of genetic drift I would like you to look at. Okay, so these are some similar cartoons demonstrating genetic drift, the bottleneck effect, and founder effect, which, like I said, are all very similar, and they mostly depend on the fact, they mostly rely on the fact that if there's a sudden reduction in the size of a population, then the subsequent population, if it successfully reproduces, is going to be significantly different than the original population. So think about that in the context of reducing biodiversity on Earth and how that's going to affect populations of animals and plants that human beings have an effect on.